It's great to be here to share with you. If you've ever done data collection for a survey, I think one of the things you most look for, most want to say to a respondent is your data will be confidential. And if you can't tell it to them, there's a good chance that they won't agree to participate in the survey. Or if they do participate in the survey, then they may not always tell you the truth. Or they may, like I would do if you asked me what my income is, I would probably just say, well, I'll give you it in broad categories, but I won't tell you the exact number. But if you promise to somebody confidentiality, then you're more likely to get complete answers, to get a full survey, and to get accurate data. Not only that, you have an ethical obligation. You don't want somebody to be hurt just because they participate in the surveys. You want to protect them, and you want to keep the data safe. So that's almost always the first thing we want to do in any survey, is to make that promise. Well, in SIPP, that gets complicated. Part of the problem is SIPP has such personal data. It collects data on income and assets. It has all kinds of private information people would not want to share. And so it makes it even more important that you can promise confidentiality. And that's why, as Jason was saying, Census decided they needed to, they're actually doing this, I gather, for all of their surveys, inspecting what privacy they can promise for all of their surveys and how they could continue to promise privacy. And they asked the National Academies to create a consensus panel. And you may not know what a consensus panel is, so I'm going to just give you a brief summary of that. A most basic requirement is that we collect experts in the fields, usually about 12 in our case, usually from a diversity of fields, and each having their own area of expertise. And what they're asked to do is to come to complete consensus. And by that, I mean 100% agreement, not 50% or +1 or 2/3. Everybody's supposed to agree. They don't need to agree on every word in the text, but they should agree on every word in the conclusions and in the recommendations. So that can be a challenge, because we purposely try to get a diverse set of people with different skills and different backgrounds. But they know that that's what they're asking. We're asking of them, and we try to select cooperative people. And so they work together to come to an agreement. And so when I present these results to you today, I'm not presenting you my results. I'm presenting the results of the panel as a whole panel. And even when they write the report, they don't write just, a person might write a section or even a chapter, but nobody claims authorship of that because everything comes from the panel. It's all a panel product. I guess that means if you don't like what I say, you can blame it on the panel, since I'm not on the panel myself. But I worked with them, so I guess I have to take some of the blame too. Here's who is on our panel, and if you know the names, you'll know that they are our top experts. Mainly what I want to emphasize here is that there's a mixture of skills here. Statisticians, survey methodologists, economists, computer and data scientists, policy experts, sociologists. Some of these had a lot of experience when using SIPP, and others haven't used SIPP at all. That came in just because of their other types of skills. So all of these people together were working to read this report. And now let's talk a little bit about disclosure avoidance and what that means. It used to be that wasn't a concern. In the old days when census was taken, they were required to take the results and post them on town center, in this town square, so everybody could inspect the results and confirm that everything was right. So that was their form of quality control. And you imagine doing that now. And for a long time, there's no promise of confidentiality. It first came in 1840. At times they made promises and then violated the promises. They made promises, and then in World War I, when they wanted to conduct a military draft, they violated the promise and used the data to help to enforce the draft. It wasn't until 1954 that Title 13 was passed, and that finally gave Census the authority to hold back the data and to say no to somebody who's trying to collect the data, and to actually impose some penalties on people who tried to disclose any private information. So that's the real point where privacy protection became the greatest. At the same time, our society is changing. Well, actually, it's mixed in some ways. If you look at what people post in the social media, you'd say people don't care about privacy and they're going to tell you almost anything. Actually, whether they know it or not, you are. If you live in an urban setting, you're probably photographed about 300 times a day. If you drive a modern car, then all the information about your driving is being recorded in a special device to control that data. If you're in a cyberspace, then everything you do is recorded. And maybe most critically, it used to be that data were scattered all over the place, and often on paper records. So you wanted to compile data on somebody, you might have to go to one city to find their marriage records, and another city to find something about housing, and so forth. Now these data are all being digitized, and there are web scraping techniques that can reach across multiple sources and gather the data. So data that once were scattered and hard to get are now available to almost anybody who has the right technology and the right knowledge. And data that we thought were private or reasonably controlled no longer are. Complicating that, SIPP is a little bit harder than most surveys in terms of protecting privacy because of two special features. One is that it's not just a survey of individuals, but of households. And there's information on every member of the household. So what that means is, for example, looking at SIPP 2020, we have one Black male living in Florida, born in 1946. There are probably a lot of those. But if you also note that he's married to an Asian female born in 1941, well, there are fewer interracial marriages, and so that's much more limited supply. If you then also know that in the household is also a child born in 1968, you're getting to a pretty fine level of detail. In SIPP, that's certainly a unique household. There's nobody else with that set of characteristics. I don't know about the state of Florida, whether that would still be true. We had complete data, but you can see how as you add more and more data, it gets harder and harder to protect the data because there's just more and more that you can match. And SIPP just has more data to match than almost any other survey. Added to that, it's a longitudinal survey, so we have measures of change over time. If somebody gets married or has a new child or gets divorced, you can see that change over time, and you can measure that against your own knowledge about change over time from other kinds of measures. And that gives you another way of matching and trying to identify somebody uniquely. So what do you do? How do you assess what the level of risk is? And how do you decide when the data are safe and when they aren't? Well, the Census Bureau, at the same time that the academies were conducting their work, did its own study, one of the best techniques available, a re-identification study. They took the SIPP data and matched it against taxpayer data, which is a nice, complete data set. And they found that age was a variable that was most disclosive. In addition, the panel thought state would probably have been highly disclosive, but they didn't include it in the design as a test variable because they instead were breaking the data into smaller parts because there was so much data. And so they're testing at the state level rather than testing the impact of state. But their conclusion was, at this time, there is no serious risk of disclosure, no kinds of immediate actions are required. Well, the panel was very impressed by that study and how it was done and how well it was documented and all of the things were done. But they felt more work is needed. And one issue is just that all SIPP respondents need to be examined and not just the primary taxpayers. For one thing, there are other taxpayers in the households besides the primary taxpayers, particularly if you have a several person household. And some members of the household aren't taxpayers at all. And so they're not getting matched in with their characteristics. It's also important to consider what other data intruders might try to use. The more data you have, each extra variable adds more risk. And so there are a lot of variables in the taxpayer data that are in other files that are available. And so those need to be inspected to see what kinds of risks they would create. Another is that they could experiment with different thresholds. What they tried to look at is the top 5 matches, among those how many were correct matches and how many were false positives. Well, they selected smaller thresholds, and you would have fewer false positives, and so you might produce more measures of risk. And finally, going back to what I said earlier, there needs to be more substantive look at what impact you can measure by looking at changes over time. Well, they did look at whether people moved from one area to another, but not at other kinds of measures of time, like divorces and new children. And look at what effect it has to look at multiple members in a household. The panel decided to ask the Census Bureau to work with us in doing a data analysis of the 2020 survey to look at how unique people are and how much it is required in order to identify somebody as being uniquely identified. It turns out that just 6 variables alone, sex, race, ethnicity, state, birth year, and highest level of education, are enough to uniquely identify 59% of the primary respondents in terms of the SIPP sample. That is, within the SIPP sample, there's no other person who has that exact same combination of characteristics for 59% population of the sample. If you add just one more variable, number of children, that increases to 78% unique. Add another one, including a measurement of time, that goes up to 93% unique. Or in the same way, if you add just one more person, then that brings you up to 91% unique. Now, what we don't know is how unique those people are in the entire United States population. We know that they're unique within the SIPP sample, but we don't know. So we can't say as a panel that what the level of risk is. What the panel did conclude is there's a substantial likelihood that there may be risk. And this is something that needs to be studied in much more depth. So here were the conclusions. One, they congratulated the census on doing a very good job. It's a very useful first start. But there needs to be more than one-time checks. There need to be regular re-identification studies. They need to be done before and after the data, or something done to the data, protect the data. And there needs to simply be more data and more kinds of analysis before one has a complete measure of what the level of risk is. So in trying to decide what to do then, the next task of the panel is to decide, well, how are the data used and how would that affect what we need to do about the level of risk? Maybe you only just could produce a smaller extract of the public use file, and maybe that would be sufficient, and that would make it easier to protect the data. Or maybe you could release the SIPP data in multiple modules, and each module would only have a smaller set of data, making it again harder to do a match. Or maybe there's just a good substitute and you don't need SIPP at all. Well, I'll deal with that last one first. As Jason was mentioning, there are a lot of very good surveys out there that can contain a lot of good data, but SIPP is unique in the combination of different characteristics it has. It's unique and it has better breadth of data than the CPS. It has longitudinal data, unlike the American Community Survey. It has cross-sectional survey that can be weighted up to the population as a whole. It has a larger sample size and panel studied income dynamics. And it has detailed data on program participation. And I can't even, it has longitudinal data. It also, researchers who use SIPP use it for a wide variety of topics. And you can see just looking at this, I don't need to read this to you, but they use it to look at economic data, as what's going on in the economy and what's happening among households in the economy. You look at it to monitor federal programs in terms of, for example, projecting what would happen if you change eligibility requirements. And you can plug those numbers into SIPP and see how many more people will be eligible and what impact that might have on the budget. Policy researchers use it for all kinds of reasons. Look at housing and healthcare, poverty, occupational licensing, creating a safety net, minimum wage. There's just a strong number of measures can be used and examined with it. And it's used for topics that really have nothing to do with income and finances. People use it to study immigration. They look at parental presence. They look at it in terms of multiple births and how across multiple family partners. They look at whether people take leave after the first birth of a child. So there are lots of different kinds of ways the data can be used, and that actually are used. And doing a literature review of the 50 most cited studies over the last of SIPP, and also another study of the most recent studies in the last year, 86 or 87% of the literature used SIPP in a way that was unique. That could not have been done with another survey because of the unique characteristics that SIPP offered. And people made a whole variety of choices. They often use highly granular data. And what that means is it just makes it harder to find a substitute, such as to create a table generator or something like that, because they often can look at the data in very individual kinds of ways where they need to be able to control how the data are used. These are both longitudinally and as cross sections. And they use it examining a wide variety of topics. Most commonly wealth and disability, income dynamics, but also looking at immigration, hardship, life events, people's program use, looking at what different fields in which the publications come. You see earnings, employment, sociology, public policy. I won't read all of these to you, but you can see that there's just a wide variety of topics that people address through SIPP. So what do we conclude? People primarily use the public use data file. If you eliminate the public use file, you would eliminate most of the users, or not the users, but you would eliminate that research, unless those people were able to find some other technique of accessing the data. If you know SIPP's history, you know there have been a couple times it came close to being canceled. So it's important to keep the researchers out there, to keep them using SIPP. And so it's important to maintain a public use data file. Here's a way of looking at that. We put out a call of information asking SIPP users to comment on in several ways about how they use the data. You can see that the greatest use was of the public use file. About half as many used synthetic data, and maybe less than half of that, again, were using data through the FSRDCs. So you need the public use data. That also told us the simplest kinds of solutions that wouldn't really work. People tend to use complex models. They tend to do more things than a table generator could support. And they use models across a wide variety of domains. As I said, you can't just break the survey into different modules. And so there's not a simple fix. Well, what's left? What can we do to try to lessen risk? The panel said we need a fallback tool that provides high degree of access. You need to have that when you can't use public data. And they looked at several different strategies, using synthetic data with or without formal privacy, using a tiered access system, using a remote analysis platform, and then as a special topic, looking at small area estimates. Synthetic data are already used or have been used with SIPP on a more limited basis. The difficulty is that right now the technology is just not there, not to create a full sample SIPP given its size and number of variables and given its complex structure. What can be done is to create a small subset of variables that could be added to a public use file if the particular variables are considered to be at risk, but that wouldn't be a solution for the whole file. And just as a comment, if you have a synthetic file, you still have to check it for disclosure risks too. It doesn't guarantee that you've eliminated the risk, but it does help you, and it also provides a measure of deniability for the respondent, saying, well, these are what I said, though these are synthetic data. So there is some use for synthetic data, but at the current time, probably just as supporting a public release file. And that does involve other kinds of complications. When you use synthetic data, then the researchers need to know, would you get the same results if they use the original data? So there needs to be some kind of way of validating the results and confirming whether they're correct or not. And in the long run, there needs to be a long-term strategy for developing this technology so it can accommodate more complex files like the SIPP. A second, and the panel thought one of the best options is what they called tiered access or the secure online data access. And Census Bureau already offers this in one way. It offers it through the FSRDCs. And in since the pandemic, they're offering a new access to the FSRDCs where you no longer have to be there in person, but can access it online. Even given that, though, most people have difficulty using them. It's very hard to get approval. Well, you have to go through a background check. You have to have a very definite proposal that it justifies why such data would be useful to the Census Bureau. And particularly, it costs money. You have to pay fees even if you're using it online. And so that creates inequities in terms of what researchers can use it. And so it provides a valuable function, but not a function that would accommodate the number of users that currently are trying to use SIPP or are using SIPP with a public use file. It's possible to create an intermediate system that doesn't have quite this level of security as FSRDC, but still is secure. And this is actually done in many places and by many agencies and for many different surveys. So it's not new technology, it's already done. And the idea is you have controlled access. People have to have a computer that's controlled in some way in terms of whether it can access the internet while it's connected to the tiered system. You can ask people to sign statements agreeing to certain terms of usage for the file. One thing that the panel looked at, though, was, well, does Title 13 get in the way of that? And their answer was no, because FSRDCs are actually requiring much more than Title 13 requires. There are different policy regulations that have been adopted to interpret Title 13, but they put in much more than it says itself, such things as requiring background checks. So that's not required in the title. That's something that was added on. And the nature of what kind of package you have to submit in order to get approval, or what kinds of conditions you have to meet in order to show this is worthwhile research. So a lot of these things aren't actually in Title 13. A lot of these things could be relaxed, and doing that would make sense given current legislation, which emphasizes we should be using data for evidence building, and we should be using tiered access. You might still have multiple levels, particularly if you're going to do data merges or allow data merges with other files, such as tax data. It would make sense to continue to require FSRDC access in order to get such data. But Other kinds of data could be being made available just online through a secure system. There would still be some development work. You can't just jump into it. You have to create a disclosure review system to decide what data can be allowed out. And you might do something to insert in ways to help prevent disclosure risk. So there's some development process required to do all of this. The panel also looked at creating what they called a remote analysis platform, and there are kind of two levels of this. The idea is that people never get the data themselves. They simply go into a warehouse where they put in their requirements for what they want and get the table or analysis, but the data themselves are never actually available, just the final output. And when you do that, you could program into that, infusing some noise into the outputs, and that wouldn't compromise data validity. The problem right now is that the kinds of data analysis that current users currently are doing are too complex for just a simple table generator. They require a fairly complex kind of system that would do complex analysis. And that would take some work to develop, and it's not clear how much demand there would be. But it might, a first start might just be to create a table builder, and that might create more demand for SIPP just from people who currently think SIPP is already too complex and create more use. And that might help to determine what future demand there might be for a more complex kind of system. And in terms of small area estimates, it depends a lot on what you want. There's several different kinds of approaches. If you're only concerned about clustering, then it might be that you can just substitute other kinds of measures that don't identify states and not have to worry about it. Let people have fairly close accurate data. If people want to do state kinds of measures, comparisons across states, and for something like that, you probably need to move to something like secure online data access. And there might be intermediate steps such as creating certain kinds of measures based on geographic region or other kinds of more combined tools rather than state specifically. Well, what does this mean in terms of working with the data users? One thing is there'll need to be more communication and more cooperation, and on both levels, both learning from the users and giving data to the users. One thing is that data users will need more information about which form of access they would need and how to do that and what the impact would be on their analysis if, say, they use synthetic data or some data that are altered in some kind of way, or if, say, formal privacy is adopted. You also, at the same time, census might benefit by getting new opinions, by getting new ideas on how to do its privacy controls, and bringing in new people to work with it could be very useful. So it needs to be regular contact in both directions. Now about timeline. As I said, some of these things are going to take time to develop. You can't do it all at once. You can't just immediately jump into something, partly because the technology isn't always even there. So in the short term, the Census Bureau could simply do some traditional steps, coarsen the data a little. Perhaps for something like age, you might have age in broad categories rather than specific ages, and still keep enough detail to allow for determining eligibility. You could add a registration process and user agreements, so making people aware that they are committing to how the data will be used, what they can release. And maybe some synthetic data might be added to the public use file. Always you want to do that in such a way that you don't stop use of the file or make use of the file difficult. The next most immediate thing that can be done would be secure online data access, because as I said, that's an existing system already in use, that's not for SIPP. And there'd be decisions to make. You might want to hire a private contractor or create some kind of infrastructure, and they would need to decide what application process to have and what disclosure reviews would be conducted and how they'd be conducted. The more they can automate them, the better. Next might be a table generator, which is easier to construct than a complete system. And as I said, if you start with that, that might determine the demand and the possible use of a later more system that does more complex analysis. So the panel created several milestones. And they start with basically a planning phase of assessing what the risks are, then starting to implement those in terms of the simplest kinds of use, continuing the public use file, designing the flexible table generator and beginning the secure online access, and then progressing in steps to it, more complex and more advanced techniques like possibly partially synthetic file, possibly formal privacy, as you develop the technology and as you build on these things that have been done earlier. So that's a quick summary of what we've done. I'd be glad at this point to answer any questions or facilitate any discussion.
Thank you very much, Brad. Yeah, I have lots of long-term questions, right? Because I was the one that said, hey, we need this panel, and I think we really do, because thinking about the risks and the long-term use of SIPP, we really want to make sure that it's getting into the hands of data users in ways that that can be valuable, productive, and that can reassure them. So I definitely, if anyone has questions, I have lots of thoughts about the tiered access and about kind of thinking through Title 13. That is definitely a big question, what Title 13, how we protect the data, because of course, it is our grounding for how data are protected, what the promises that we make to the respondents, and that's that's really important. It's even more important now as you demonstrate and show what the level of risk is at a broad level. But we don't want to limit researchers' ability to use the data, because after all, that's the reason we're collecting the data, is to provide information. I'm curious, did the panel think about the data user tier from the point of view of what agencies, other agencies, non-census agencies might need versus individual data users in like an academic setting? Or was it really like structured around the types of analyses?
It probably, I didn't make a specific point of differentiating between the two. It was more around the types of analyses, and it probably was more because it was focused on articles published in the literature, focused more on academic types of uses. I think also there's some assumption that within an agency, it's easier to get around privacy just by having interagency agreements that don't require all the same kinds of controls as for a public use file. So its greatest attention was to the public use file and what would be needed for that.
Yeah, well, I mean, we do require the other participants or users from other agencies to go through the full Title 13 approval process, become special sworn to access data internally to the census. And other than that, I think most are using the public use versions of the file. There were some comments from the panel around what types of ongoing evaluations of the risk needed to be undertaken. And just, I know that there's not a clear, obvious answer. Where would you see that federal surveys broadly are in terms of being active in evaluating risk, in terms of privacy protections and public use data releases? What do we as a field, as a group of agencies, as a group of researchers, where do we need to be going? Are we asking for tiered access from all the agencies? Is this, what are the unique components here that folks should be thinking about?
The agencies take a variety of different kinds of approaches. And one of the simplest is what the National Center for Education Statistics does, where some kinds of files, they require you to click to say that you acknowledge that the data, they'll respect privacy. But after that, they can simply download a file. They don't have to sign any forms or go through any inspection, but they are doing something to acknowledge that they have seen that. I think most go a little bit farther than that. They might require a research proposal and signing a statement setting more specific requirements as to what you will do. National NCES, as I said, for some files, they will have you just click. For other files, you have to apply and get special permission to access the file. So it's this a lot of different strategies they use. And I'd say, as I commented, an awful lot of them have moved to online access using some kind of control. I think often they do that through a contractor such as Norc or Westat or some company like that that can help provide the facilities for that. But
right.
That seems most practical, as I said.
There's a lot of attractiveness in coming up with the online data access system, which lets you essentially, do the analysis behind a firewall or in a compartmentalized section of a computing system and get your analysis out, which is, automatically cleared and validated. That has a lot of attractiveness to me. I think the things I worry about, and we are getting a couple of questions in which I'll come to in just a sec. A couple of the things that I think about is with this, I click to agree or I sign something, and is that once you've released the data file into the wild, it's out there. And that, that has been a concern at the Census Bureau. And I know that it's a different model than a lot of the historically academically run surveys have used, where you can sign an agreement and get a CD with a copy of the data, et cetera. I think my thoughts are that the data access system is probably a more long-term viable solution. You could update the protections if you needed to ongoing, and you don't have data out in the wild. Is that part of the discussion that the panel engaged in?
Yeah, they leaned more towards that, to online access as opposed to just distributing the file in a signed agreement. I will comment that what some organizations do, or some agencies do, is they say, we will enforce this against the entire institution and not just the researcher. So if a researcher fails, that entire university might lose access to the data files, and not just the researcher being punished. And so that creates more reasons for people to comply and more reasons for people to inspect to make sure they're compliant. But still, yeah, I would agree that online seems safer than actually distributing files.
Yeah. So a first question came through that Tori mentioned. This is Becky Heller's question. Tori mentioned the expanding use of administrative records in SIPP, and am I able to? I assume this is a question for me rather than Brad. Am I able to elaborate on what records and uses are planned, and how do those plans interact with privacy protections? So, so I think this is actually a question for both of us. At a high level, SIPP has been using administrative records more broadly and in greater incorporation than many other surveys. We use administrative records currently in editing and imputation. We use administrative records in some of the modeling work, certainly in analysis and validation on the back end. Administrative records are used pretty broadly. We are expanding the use of administrative records in a couple different ways. We are looking at additional integration into the data collection process through adaptive design, and where administrative records can help us prioritize and ensure data quality and ensure representativeness. We're looking at use of administrative records in sampling and in frame development, and to work on bias reduction methods and think about data quality right from the frame on, and where administrative records might play a role. SIPP Synthetic has been a tool that has provided access to linked administrative records with survey data, providing essentially lifetime W-2 records or benefits records, and doing so in a way that the data are synthesized. You can run analyses on restricted use data on the synthetic data, and then get it validated against the restricted use gold standard data. The privacy protections in terms of the sampling side and the editing and imputation are all embedded into the data processing. We're not actually putting administrative outputs directly onto the file. I think that how do the interaction with the privacy protection, I think that this is part of the tiered access in my mind, that if folks are using or want to use administrative records in combination with SIPP, that's one of the things that probably puts them, in the FSRDC framework. If you're an external user, if you're another agency, it probably puts you in the context of, a specific agreement where the data are handled in a similar type of level of protection. Administrative records, Brad, did the panel talk about administrative records use and how those might play into future protections?
They did. One thing is, the Census Bureau was actually one of the first and the best in terms of providing the merging in synthetic data of administrative records with the SIPP data. So that was really a great start. One of the concerns or issues, as you know, is that different agencies have different requirements, and IRS in particular has its own legislation protecting the data. So depending on what data you are trying to merge in, some of them, by necessity, you would have to have probably an FSRDC just because it's not because of Census Bureau data, but because of the other data. So I suspect it just will vary from one agency to another in terms of what their restrictions are. Sometimes it might be that just secure online data access would be sufficient, but sometimes it might require FSRDCs.
Right, and that's a great point. All of our administrative data or third-party data that are brought into the Census Bureau are covered and governed by memorandum of understanding and use agreements. So it's not just the Census Bureau's requirements for how those data are used, but the providing agency or entity has a great deal of say in that. We are thinking about we're working on ways to make sure that those agreements support future analyses and future work. So that is a discussion that is ongoing with agencies and other data providers as we bring in data to be used in combination. So there's two more quick questions I hope we should have time for. So the first is, could we discuss what tiered access might look like on the continuum of, I'm sorry. Anthony said, yeah, let me ask this and then we'll come back to the raised hand. What might tiered access look like? What was the panel's vision of in the continuum of public use data, synthetic data, access through the RDC? Where they're asking, where would tiered access fall? And my quick comment on that is tiered access is talking about all of it. Public use data is an open tier, right? And then as you need additional detail and access, that's what a tiered access system looks like. But Brad, can you talk about what the panel envisioned a little bit about tiered access and what maybe some good examples of it are?
Yeah, the basic idea is that there are multiple tiers or multiple ways of access. So as you said, a public use file is one type of access, FSRDCs is another type of access, the SIPP and synthetic data were a third type, a secure online data access would be a fourth type, a table generator or remote analysis would be another type. So they're all different ways of providing an approach to get into the data, and they all have different pluses and minuses. The table generator has the advantage of being simpler to use, maybe, and I found out myself how complex it is and how difficult it is to work with SIPP data. So sometimes those are adopted simply for reasons of ease of use. the one we talked about most as a panel in terms of recommending the most was the secure online data access, because it's a way of providing probably not all the data. There might be still some data within the file that are still considered too secure to be available at that level and can only be available at the FSRDC. But it could provide much more of the data than would be available in the public use file, and will essentially allow complete access to the file with some exceptions. And what it would tend to look like is that people arrange to have a given account. Sometimes the computer which they use to access the account has to be monitored in certain kinds of ways. Sometimes it has to be kept in a secure room or a separate room. There has to be special permissions as to how they use that computer while accessing the data. Important part is to, as I said, establish a user agreement that creates some sense of liability so that people know what the penalties are and know that they're at risk. Current penalties allow for fines of up to $4 million, and they're severe penalties. Sometimes possibly so severe that people might be afraid to impose them. But they are there. They can be strong ways of protecting the data if people are aware that they're liable and aware of what they are doing. Beyond that, as said, there can be advantages to having an institutional involvement as well as just an individual responsible, so that the institution can be held responsible if a particular researcher fails, and that gives them a reason to also enforce the right kinds of rules.
Yeah, when you say institution in this context, you mean the external researcher's home institution, rather than the Census Bureau as an institution. Yeah.
Right.
Anthony, there's a raised hand. I see a note. Could we invite that person?
Go ahead, Robert. Your line should be open. Looks like they may have lowered their hand.
Okay. Fine. So I think, and David McMillan asked a question that is, kind of right in line with the discussion we were just having. So, did the panel discuss an approach, as you were alluding to, where maybe it's the user that is held more liable, and that there would actually be the user would be subject to civil liability should there be an inappropriate use of the restricted access data. To my knowledge, some of the penalties that are currently in place have not been ever imposed. They've been there for sure, but I don't think there's ever been a need to impose them. So, to your point, I'm not sure whether the answer is they're too big that folks are worried about ever actually imposing them. But I mean they're big for a reason. So it's a serious issue.
One thing that we did talk about is that people have a tendency to forget after a while. So that it's good to have refresher instruction or refresher courses periodically for those people who have those agreements to make sure that they continue to remember what the requirements are on them. And I'll stop there, I guess.
Yeah. No, I think, and that's an important part of when we give individuals special sworn status and bring them into the census environment, and for us as employees as well. There's an ongoing annual and ongoing review of the data security requirements, the data access. Our agreements are reviewed on a regular basis. The projects that people work on are reviewed on a regular basis, and so that type of certainty that provides in terms of how the data are being used, and that everyone who's touching them understands what the implications are, is really important. And we would have to think about that in the context of a tiered access where people were given access to something that previously they would have only been able to get internally, for example. Okay.
I will comment that
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. I will comment I'm surprised to see that the Census offers the SIPP data so freely. I guess I'm used to working with NCS data where you at least have to make a click to acknowledge a user agreement and to read through that. So I like getting data so easily, but you could easily put a little bit more hurdles in front of the way.
Well, SIPP in and of itself, and I'm being a little sarcastic here, but there are enough hurdles that people that want to use SIPP data and are ready to use SIPP data, I don't think we want to give them any more hurdles than are absolutely necessary. But we do go through a protection. The data are protected when we put it up there on the FTP site for folks to download. They're not downloading the unprotected data,
Sure.
and that would be a concern. And I guess one other last thing is, when we talk about data use, so one of the charges to the panel was thinking about data use. And I know that there were some discussions about ensuring that any protections or access didn't stop the data from being able to be used in the way it was intended.
Right.
And to me, that's really important. And can you talk a little bit about some of the discussions that the panel might have had in terms of the complexity of SIPP data, ensuring that the relationships are maintained through the protections and through the access systems?
Well, part of what they said is that people really need access to basically the raw data. They just do too many individual manipulations of the data to do too much to it before it gets released. And that's part of the problem with something like a table generator is that it just, I don't think could easily accommodate all of the different permutations of the data or things that people might want to do. So I'm losing my train of thought here. Ask your question again.
Yeah. Well, so I guess my question and my thought is, like, as I think about protecting SIPP data, providing access to SIPP data, some of the options that we have, such as synthetic data or reducing the geography available on public use, that initial lowest tier of data, impact the usability of the data in ways that, like, might diminish its value without the ability to do, like you're saying, validation or have a companion product that is available with more comprehensive information. So thinking about the protections that might have to be put in place, I guess the panel placed a good deal of priority, at least in my impression, on the data usability and on the limitations of synthetic data from the point of view of being the only source for analysis, or the importance of having state level data when looking at program use. How much of, I guess, in the discussion that the panel had, what were there other constraints that came up as important constraints that counter-pulled against the protections, right?
Well, I think the biggest risk to the protections is simply the quantity and types of data available. There's just so much to it to match against. And the thought of the panel was that secure online data access comes the closest to giving you what they already would have with the public use file. It creates a process first where they have to go through to first initialize that. But once they are in the system, they have much more freedom to work with the data and to do the kinds of manipulations they want. So the thought was that for now, that's the most easily available kind of solution. In the long run, a fully synthetic public use file might be a possibility, or a fully synthetic formal pregnancy file might be available. Those are things to work towards. They aren't things that did.
Brad, right now, Robert Moffat has his hand raised. Anthony, can we let Robert unmute?
Can you hear me now?
Yep, Robert's on now. Thank you. Go ahead. Go ahead with your question, Robert.
Sure. I apologize before you asked me to talk and I couldn't unmute myself, so I wasn't able to talk and then got shut. Anyway, my name is Robert Moffat. I was a member of the panel and Brad did an outstanding summary of our report. I just wanted to add a couple of big picture things that both of which Brad mentioned, but just want to emphasize. One is that the panel said that they believe that more re-identification work needed to be done. And by saying that, they were not ready to say that there are major disclosure risks. We do not know, and you shouldn't interpret the panel's recommendations as saying, yes, we have a problem. The panel is saying we don't know if we have a problem, and more work needs to be done on that. A lot of people come into the SIPP and say, well, look at how many variables there are on the SIPP. It's a panel data set, all these things which increase the suspicions that there are high disclosure risks, but we do not know yet, and it may be that the disclosure risks are not that large, or they may be only high for a particular subset of variables that we don't know yet. So conducting the re-identification attack experiments is really critical before you do anything else. And that's a very difficult exercise, and we hopefully didn't just imply that it's easy. The other thing to say is that it's always difficult to express in a panel report like this, but kind of as you were implying, Jason, that there's a trade-off between data usability and protection, and the level of protections you want to impose should be balanced against the effects of those protections on data usability. And for example, if you don't have remote access, and if the alternative is only in-person FSRDC, well, that you might suffer a big loss in data usability and in research. And you might not want to do it in circumstances where you might want to do it if an easier mode of access, like a remote access, were available. So that decision itself is all based upon how much data usability would be lost and how much research value would be lost. So that's another thing that was in the report, like I said, a little difficult to impose. So it's all a complex issue, but I just want to say that the panel was not prepared to say, didn't believe they had the information to say that there are current high disclosure risks. That remains to be determined. Anyway, I don't know if that helps, but I just wanted to add those thoughts. Thank you.
Oh, that definitely helps. And thank you, Robert. Well, at this time, I want to thank Brad very much for being willing to come on and talk about the RCNStat panel on the roadmap to disclosure. If you look in the slides when they're released, the link for all the CNStat reports is available. I would encourage folks to look at it and look at the recommendations and think about the ways that the panel thought about the risk to disclosure. And as Robert said, it's not totally clear, what that risk is exactly at the moment. So more work on that is definitely needed and ongoing. But again, thank you, Brad. Thank you very much for kicking us off here. And we have a 10-minute or so break. And